we're talking about the role that will plays in Kant's moral philosophy and the fact that you need um, to align your will with a duty. So, a lot of the text in the end of the first section and in the second section are going to be talking about sort of like how we go about aligning our will with duty. In the first section, early on, he's still concerned with the role that reason plays in the regulation of the will. Um, and part of his argument involves overcoming this idea that happiness has to be the highest goal. So he says, what is the use of reason for, right? It can't necessarily be for fulfilling happiness because, one, reason doesn't guide us reliably toward our ends. We fail often to achieve what we want. Or even sometimes we just like miscalculate and make a little error, like um, I will to take a drink and I miss my mouth a little bit and spill, So that's an act of my will. I flubbed it, I didn't accomplish it. Now, of course, sometimes the stakes are much higher and I fail to accomplish saving someone, from a burning building, and I don't do it, right? I fail. It's too hot. I get scared. The way to the person becomes impassable. Something happens and it prevents me. But Kant still wants to say that could still be a morally praiseworthy act, even if you don't accomplish it. So reason, because it doesn't lead necessarily to the accomplishment of our ends, is not very good for securing happiness. Nature would have been much better to instill in us like an instinct that just drove us by causal necessity for happiness, rather than mess around with the reason and the will that can kind of pull us this way and that and can fail to accomplish its goals and so on and so forth. Reason actually in a lot of ways raises a lot more problems for us. He says as much really here in page 9. So what reason really must do is bring about a good will, something that can be purified of all of these empirical complications, the complications that arise from our particular sort of like tendencies, our situation, that it won't matter if our path is blocked by, the burning building, or if we fail to achieve our goal or something like that, right? So he's going to develop this idea of the will that's good in and of itself, right? Now, the idea of duty, Kant thinks, again, think of peeling back the onion or the nesting dolls. The idea of duty contains the idea of the goodwill, right? Because if you can see what your duty is, if a principle is presented to you that you should follow it, I will do my duty, I will follow this rule, then the ability to follow that rule already depends upon your ability to will it, right? The way that the will works for Kant is basically that I can project an end. I can say, here's something I want to achieve. And then I can work toward the achievement of that goal. Now, in order to regulate myself, because to achieve a goal requires self-regulation and self-discipline, I have to follow certain steps in order to achieve my goal. That's where reason comes in, because reason provides the rules whereby I can regulate myself in order to achieve my end. Now again, think back to the overview of Kant's critical philosophy. I don't produce these reasons and rules like explicitly, consciously. I don't come up with an idea of something I want to do, even in the very short term, even walk across the room to get a book off the shelf, or drive to the store. to pick up some milk or whatever the case may be. I don't sit down all the time and write out like, okay, I do X, Y, Z. But if I think about it, I can say, oh, well, to do that, I had to do these things. I had to make sure that I completed these steps, implicitly following some rules to achieve my end, right? Since reason is bound up in this production of rules that are practical, that are geared toward the achievement of my ends, that's where I should look for morality. That's what's going to allow me to produce a good will. It's going to, through this capacity to produce rules, it's going to allow my will to sync up with a duty. It's going to allow my will to follow universal rules. The rules produced by reason in order to govern the will could be universal. They could be followed all time, all times, all places, all people, insofar as they're rational, all rational beings. Right? So we'll see at the end of the first section, Kant is going to begin to introduce the categorical moral imperative, and he's really going to highly develop it in the second section. But the very first run at the categorical moral imperative touches on this universal rules, right? This capacity to produce these universal rules. So, what's interesting for Kant, since the good will is good even when it doesn't affect its consequences, and because the good will is good only in a formal way, independently of our tendencies, Kant wants to narrow down the cases of interest. He doesn't think it's philosophically interesting to consider cases where my action is obviously contrary to duty, right? Clearly you shouldn't do that. That's not super interesting, really, for Kant. He also is not super interested in cases where people don't have an immediate inclination to fulfill their duty, but they have some like general inclination. So the example that Kant uses is a clerk at a store who charges a fair price to everybody. Now, this isn't, and there's no sort of immediate inclination charging a fair price to everybody. The clerk doesn't get it right away, any good benefits. But in the general sense, sort of one step removed from the immediate situation, the clerk benefits by running an honest business. People know that they can go to the store, they pay a fair price, he gives a fair price to the child who might not know any better, he doesn't overcharge them, even though he could take advantage of them because they're a child and they might not know any better, and so on and so forth. So in a kind of roundabout way, the clerk benefits from being honest because people now trust him. He can carry on business as usual. People come in, they pay, whatever. So he doesn't have like an immediate advantage by charging a fair price, but in the sort of big picture, he gets like a secondary or an advantage once removed, right? Kant isn't really interested in those kinds of cases, again, because Kant needs to be able to show that someone's doing something for the right reasons, that they're doing something merely because it accords with duty, and not because it has some particular motivation or inclination behind it, right? He needs to, because he's concerned with the pure part of ethics, he has to strip all of that particular empirical content out of it, right? He's not really if he's not interested in these secondary motivations, he is also not interested in immediate ones. So he says like to preserve your own life is a duty, but we also have an immediate inclination to do so. Most people prefer life over not. So what Kant is really, really going to focus on is situations in which I should act in accordance with duty, but I'm actually disinclined to do so. So he's interested in cases in which I act in accordance with duty, but it's very difficult for me. I have all kinds of incentives and inclinations to not do that, to go actually against duty. Kant thinks that that will make his idea sort of shine forth more clearly. He talks about it shining forth like a jewel. If in these dark circumstances you can make the light of the goodwill shine out, in that darkness when, I don't really want to do my duty, but I do it anyway. So you can think of people who's in a terrible, awful situation, who have every reason to give up living or something. Someone in a concentration camp or something like that, who the situation's really dire and people around them are dying, and they lose the sort of will to live, right? They lose that immediate inclination to keep living, but they kind of soldier on anyway, right? Even in the face of sort of like great adversity. That's the kind of situation where Kant really thinks the goodwill becomes very clear when people act in accordance with duty, even when they have no desire or no inclination to do that. Right. That is what he really finds to be the sort of interesting case. And you can see how he uses examples here. He's using them to be sort of illustrative, like this is the kind of situation I'm talking about. But what he's interested in is actually the formal structure of those situations. He's interested in the sort of logic of them in the abstract. We're not really gleaning anything from these examples except it allows Kant to illustrate the distinctions that he's talking about. He's not presenting them as like evidence for his argument or anything like that. So what we get out of this discussion, so one proposition is that basically an action must be done from duty, for duty's sake, in order to have moral worth. So we have to do the right thing for the right reason because we recognize it as a duty. It's a very stringent sort of requirement. Okay. That is clear in all of the examples that he gives. Remember, what's messing up the moral worth of like that clerk's actions is his desire to have an effective business or to benefit from his reputation for honesty. To preserve our life, maybe we're acting in accordance with duty, but we're immediately inclined to do so. We benefit in some way from it. We have a desire for it. Our actions are only going to have moral worth for Kant when they're done for duty's sake, purely because it is the right thing to do and we recognize it as such. So that's the first proposition, that action has to be performed out of duty, out of respect for the moral law, in order to have moral worth. Now, again, the reason, this is the second proposition, he says, an action done from duty has its moral worth, not in the purpose that is to be attained by it, but in the maxim according to which the action is determined. So we need to look at these rules. The word that Kant uses here is maxim, and this is another bit of Kant vocabulary. It's just a rule that we follow in order to achieve an end, or in order to achieve our purpose, right? So he's going to use this word maxim a lot to refer back to those rules that are produced by reason that we follow in order to achieve some end, right? So that is where we're going to have to look. We want to see what those rules are, and we want to see if those rules are universal, if they can be applied outside of the context that generates them. If they can't be universalized, they're not going to conform with duty, because duty is a universal law. And that's what he is interested in. He wants a moral law that will apply to all people at all places and all times. So if in any particular situation you're going to follow a rule that can't be universalized, that can't be generalized beyond that situation, it's no good, right? Here's where we get, again, this idea that duty has some kind of necessity to it. And we're going to have to think, I think, as we move, what he means by this necessity. Because the third proposition, here it is, duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the moral law. He says I can have an inclination for an object as an effect of my proposed action, but I can't have respect for that object, right? We can't have respect for that object. So this idea of respect for the moral law is important. So there's our propositions. The first one being that an action must be done from duty in order to have moral worth. That the second proposition, an action done from duty has moral worth not in its purpose or what we hope to attain by it, but according to the maxim, according to the rule. And then finally, the third proposition, that duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the moral law. And so the moral law has to be something respectable. We have to be able to respect it. So those are the propositions. And at the very end of the first section, he begins to develop the idea of universality. It will be the first formulation of the categorical moral imperative, right? So that is going to be the whole subject of the second section, really, is going to be unpacking this moral imperative. So we'll stop there, and we'll come back and cover the very end of section 1 and move into section 2 of the grounding for the metaphysics of morals.